August 9, 1945. 4:00 a.m. Soviet Manchurian border, 45 kilometers northeast of Mutanchiang. Colonel General Alexei Antonov stood in the pre-dawn darkness, his breath visible in the cold morning air as he watched the largest military operation in Soviet Far Eastern history unfold before his eyes. Behind him, 1. 5 million Soviet troops, 500 tanks, and 3. 900 aircraft prepared to cross into Japanese-occupied Manchuria. The sound of tank engines warming up created a low, mechanical rumble that seemed to make the earth itself vibrate. In exactly 1 hour, Operation August Storm would begin, and the final chapter of World War II would be written in blood and steel across the frozen plains of northeastern China. What nobody expected, including Stalin himself, was that this massive invasion would lead to one of the most dramatic confrontations between individual commanders in the entire war. The plan had been months in the making. Following the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Stalin had promised Roosevelt and Churchill that the Soviet Union would enter the war against Japan within 3 months of Germany's surrender. Germany had surrendered on May 8th, and now, exactly 3 months later, Stalin was making good on his promise. But this wasn't just about fulfilling agreements with Western allies. Stalin saw an opportunity to expand Soviet influence in the Far East, to reclaim territories lost in the humiliating Russo-Japanese War of 1905, and to position the USSR as a major power in post-war Asia. The Japanese Kwantung Army in Manchuria, once considered among the finest fighting forces in the world, had been severely weakened by transfers of troops and equipment to defend Japan itself against the expected American invasion. Intelligence reports indicated that of the original million-man force, fewer than 300 claras horas errant remained combat-ready, many of them raw recruits and reservists. Soviet military planners believed they could crush Japanese resistance within weeks, perhaps days. They were almost right, but they hadn't counted on the stubborn pride of certain Japanese commanders who refused to accept that their empire was crumbling around them. Colonel General Otoso Yamada commanded what remained of the Kwantung Army from his headquarters in sinking modern-day Changchun. At 58 years old, Yamada was a career military officer who had spent most of his adult life in China, first as a young lieutenant during the Boxer Rebellion, then as a staff officer during Japan's expansion into Manchuria in the 1930s. He understood better than most that Japan's position in China was becoming untenable, but he also understood the Japanese military code that demanded fight to the death rather than surrender. Yamada had received reports throughout July and early August about massive Soviet troop buildups along the border. His own intelligence officers estimated that the Soviets had assembled a force at least 3 times larger than his own. But Emperor Hirohito had not given permission to withdraw, and Japanese military doctrine was clear. Territory once claimed by the emperor must be defended to the last man, to the last bullet, to the last breath. This philosophical commitment to absolute resistance would soon bring Yamada face to face with the most powerful man in the Soviet Union. The Soviet assault began at precisely 5:00 a.m. on August 9, 1945. Artillery barrages that had been carefully registered over the previous weeks erupted simultaneously along a front stretching over 2 miles. Soviet commanders had learned hard lessons about combined arms warfare during 4 years of fighting against Nazi Germany, and they applied those lessons with devastating effectiveness against Japanese positions. Tank armies that had smashed through German defenses now turned their attention to Japanese fortifications that had been designed primarily to defend against Chinese forces, not modern mechanized armies equipped with T-34s and IS-3 heavy tanks. The Trans-Baikal Front under Marshal Rodion Malinovsky struck from the west, while the First Far Eastern Front under Marshal Kirill Meretskov attacked from the east, and the Second Far Eastern Front under General Maxim Porkayev pushed south along the Amur and Ussuri rivers. It was a classic Soviet-style operation. Overwhelming force applied simultaneously at multiple points, designed to shatter enemy resistance through sheer momentum and firepower rather than finesse or tactical subtlety. Japanese resistance collapsed faster than even the most optimistic Soviet planners had predicted. Within 48 hours, Soviet armored spearheads had penetrated over 100 miles into Manchuria, cutting Japanese communication lines and surrounding entire garrisons before they could organize coherent defense. The speed of the Soviet advance created its own problems. Supply lines stretched thin as tanks outran their fuel trucks, and coordination between different front commands became increasingly difficult as the operation expanded across vast distances. But the momentum was unstoppable. Japanese positions that had taken years to construct were overrun in hours. Fortress cities fell without siege warfare. The myth of Japanese invincibility in land combat, already severely damaged by defeats in the Pacific, finally crumbled completely under the weight of modern mechanized warfare conducted by an army that had perfected its techniques against the Wehrmacht. If you want to discover how this massive military operation led to one of the most intense personal confrontations between enemy commanders in World War II, please leave your like on this video. This helps YouTube show these forgotten historical moments to more people. And subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, so you don't miss our next episodes. We rescue stories like this from dusty archives every single day. By August 11th, Soviet forces had captured the major city of Sitsihar and were advancing rapidly toward Harbin and Mukden. The Kwantung Army's defensive strategy, based on fighting delaying actions while falling back to prepared positions, had completely fallen apart. Units lost contact with headquarters, communications networks failed, and entire divisions simply disappeared into the chaos of retreat. Colonel General Yamada found himself in an impossible position. His army was disintegrating around him, but he had received no orders from Tokyo authorizing withdrawal or surrender. Japanese military culture demanded that he continue fighting until explicitly relieved of command by superior authority, even if that meant the complete destruction of his forces. This adherence to protocol in the face of obvious military defeat would soon bring him into direct conflict with the highest levels of Soviet leadership. The moment that would define this confrontation came on August 12th, when Soviet armored units of the 6th Guards Tank Army broke through the final defensive perimeter around Changchun and surrounded Yamada's headquarters. Rather than attempting to escape or ordering his staff to destroy sensitive documents and evacuate, Yamada made a decision that surprised both his own officers and their Soviet captors. He ordered his headquarters staff to remain at their posts and continue normal operations as if nothing had happened. When Soviet infantry stormed the building and demanded surrender, Yamada's response was immediate and uncompromising. Speaking through his interpreter, he declared that he remained in command of Japanese forces in Manchuria and would continue to execute his orders from the emperor until formally relieved of duty. The Soviet field commander, unsure how to handle a senior enemy general who refused to acknowledge that he had been captured, radioed for instructions from higher authority. That radio call would eventually reach the Kremlin, and Stalin himself would become personally involved in determining the fate of this stubborn Japanese general. Stalin received the report about Yamada's refusal to surrender while meeting with his senior military advisors in the Kremlin. The Soviet leader was in the middle of coordinating multiple aspects of the final phase of the war, including ongoing negotiations with the Americans about post-war spheres of influence in Asia and preparations for the possible invasion of Japan itself. The idea that a Japanese general could simply refuse to acknowledge military reality struck Stalin as both amusing and potentially useful. If Yamada could be convinced to formally surrender and order his remaining forces to lay down their arms, it would save Soviet lives and demonstrate Soviet dominance in the region. But if he continued to resist, his example might inspire other Japanese commanders to fight hopeless battles that would drain Soviet resources and delay Stalin's broader strategic objectives. The Soviet leader decided on a direct approach that was characteristic of his personality. He would personally communicate with Yamada and either convince him to surrender or eliminate him as an obstacle to Soviet operations. How many of you have grandparents or family members who served in World War II and never talked about what they experienced? These stories are disappearing with every passing year. Leave a comment right now saying just, "My family served." When you comment, you're not just honoring your own family's sacrifice. You're preserving historical memory for future generations. Let's create a living memorial here in the comment section. The communication between Stalin and Yamada was arranged through a series of radio transmissions that were carefully recorded by Soviet signals intelligence units. According to declassified documents from the Soviet archives, the conversation took place on the evening of August 12, 1945, with Yamada speaking from his surrounded headquarters in Changchun and Stalin responding from the Kremlin. The technical challenges of establishing clear radio communication across such vast distances meant that messages often had to be repeated multiple times, and the conversation stretched over several hours. Soviet translators worked frantically to ensure accurate translation between Russian and Japanese, knowing that any misunderstanding could have serious diplomatic or military consequences. The tone of the exchange would later be described by participants as formal but charged with underlying tension, as both men understood that they were negotiating not just the surrender of specific military units, but the broader terms under which Japan would exit the war in Asia. Stalin's opening message was characteristically direct. He informed Yamada that Soviet forces had achieved complete operational success in Manchuria, that Japanese resistance had collapsed across the entire front, and that further fighting would only result in unnecessary casualties without changing the ultimate outcome. He offered Yamada the opportunity to surrender with honor, guaranteeing humane treatment for all Japanese personnel under Soviet custody and promising that families of Japanese officers would be notified of their status. The Soviet leader emphasized that the war was essentially over that Japan itself was on the verge of surrender following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that continuing to fight in Manchuria served no legitimate military purpose. Stalin's message concluded with what amounted to an ultimatum. Yamada could either order his remaining forces to surrender immediately, or Soviet forces would continue their advance with the understanding that any Japanese resistance would be crushed without mercy. Yamada's response revealed the psychological and cultural forces that made this confrontation so intense. The Japanese commander acknowledged that his military position was hopeless and that continued resistance was unlikely to achieve tactical success. But he explained that his loyalty was to the Emperor of Japan, not to abstract concepts of military efficiency or casualty reduction. He had sworn an oath to defend Japanese territory and interests until formally relieved of that responsibility by proper authority. Since he had received no orders from Tokyo authorizing surrender, and since Japanese military law required him to continue fighting until either victory was achieved or he was killed in action, he could not comply with Stalin's demand. The Japanese concept of honor, Yamada explained, demanded that a warrior face death rather than accept defeat without explicit permission from his sovereign. This was not personal stubbornness or strategic calculation, but adherence to a moral code that defined his identity as a Japanese officer. It was at this point in the conversation that Yamada delivered the words that would make this exchange legendary among military historians. "You'll have to kill me." According to the Soviet transcript, these words were spoken in Japanese and then translated into Russian for Stalin's benefit. The phrase carried multiple layers of meaning within Japanese military culture. It was simultaneously a statement of defiance, an acknowledgment of his impossible position, and a request for an honorable death that would allow him to fulfill his obligations as a samurai warrior. Yamada was essentially asking Stalin to solve his dilemma by eliminating him, which would free his surviving subordinates to surrender without violating their own honor codes. The Japanese commander understood that his death would serve both Soviet and Japanese interests. It would remove an obstacle to ending the fighting in Manchuria while allowing him to die in accordance with the warrior traditions that had shaped his entire adult life. Stalin's response to this dramatic declaration reflected both his pragmatic approach to military problems and his understanding of the broader political implications of the moment. Rather than simply ordering Yamada's execution, which would have been the easiest military solution, Stalin recognized an opportunity to demonstrate Soviet magnanimity and to establish a precedent for Japanese surrender that could be useful in future negotiations. According to the Soviet transcript, Stalin's reply was measured and calculated to appeal to Yamada's sense of duty while offering him a path to honorable surrender. "Colonel General Yamada," Stalin said, "your emperor has already decided to surrender. Japan will announce its capitulation within hours. Your duty is not to die uselessly, but to preserve the lives of your soldiers so they can return to rebuild Japan in peacetime. The war is over. Help us end it properly." The psychological impact of Stalin's words on Yamada was immediate and profound. The Japanese commander had built his entire resistance around the belief that he was fulfilling his emperor's will by continuing to fight. If the emperor had indeed decided to surrender, then Yamada's duty was to facilitate that surrender rather than resist it. The Japanese military code that had demanded he fight to the death now demanded that he obey imperial commands to lay down arms. Soviet monitors reported that there was a long pause in radio transmission after Stalin's message, during which Yamada presumably consulted with his remaining staff officers and attempted to confirm the truth of Stalin's claim about impending Japanese surrender. Historical records show that Yamada was indeed aware of growing pressure on the Japanese government to end the war, but he had received no official confirmation that surrender negotiations were underway. The resolution of this confrontation came in stages over the next 24 hours. First, Yamada requested and received permission to contact his superiors in Tokyo to verify Stalin's claims about impending surrender. Those communications confirmed that Emperor Hirohito was indeed preparing to announce Japan's surrender, though the formal announcement would not come until August 15th. Second, Yamada negotiated specific terms for the surrender of his forces, including guarantees about treatment of prisoners, preservation of officer dignity, and arrangements for notification of families. Third, and most importantly, he insisted on personally meeting with senior Soviet commanders to formally transfer command authority, rather than simply ordering his troops to lay down their arms without proper ceremony. This demand reflected the importance of ritual and formal process in Japanese military culture, and Stalin agreed to it as a gesture of respect for Japanese sensitivities. The formal surrender ceremony took place on August 16, 1945, at a hastily constructed site near Changchun that allowed representatives from both armies to participate with appropriate dignity. Colonel General Yamada, wearing his full-dress uniform despite the circumstances, formally surrendered his sword to Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, who had arrived from Moscow specifically for this ceremony. The symbolic transfer of the Japanese commander's weapon to his Soviet counterpart was witnessed by officers from both armies and carefully documented by Soviet military photographers. According to participants, the ceremony was conducted with mutual respect and formal military courtesy, reflecting Stalin's instructions that Japanese officers should be treated as honorable enemies rather than war criminals. This approach served Soviet political interest by demonstrating that the USSR could be both militarily dominant and diplomatically sophisticated in its dealings with former enemies. The aftermath of the Yamada-Stalin confrontation had implications far beyond the immediate military situation in Manchuria. Stalin's decision to engage personally with a captured Japanese general and his willingness to negotiate terms of surrender rather than simply demanding unconditional capitulation established a precedent for Soviet treatment of Japanese military personnel that influenced post-war negotiations. Yamada himself became something of a liaison between Soviet authorities and Japanese prisoners of war, helping to organize the repatriation of hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians and military personnel who had been caught in Manchuria when the war ended. His cooperation with Soviet administration, which began with his surrender to Stalin, continued throughout the immediate post-war period and contributed to relatively smooth transitions in areas under Soviet occupation. From Stalin's perspective, the confrontation with Yamada demonstrated the effectiveness of combining overwhelming military force with sophisticated political negotiation. The Soviet leader had achieved his strategic objectives in Manchuria while also positioning the USSR as a reasonable and honorable victor in its dealings with Japan. This reputation would prove valuable in subsequent negotiations about post-war arrangements in Asia, where Soviet cooperation was essential for American plans to occupy and reconstruct Japan. The personal nature of Stalin's intervention in what could have been a routine military surrender also reflected his understanding that individual relationships and personal honor could be as important as raw military power in achieving political objectives. The speed and completeness of Soviet victory in Manchuria exceeded even Stalin's expectations and confirmed his belief that the USSR had emerged from World War II as a global military power capable of projecting force across vast distances. Operation August Storm demonstrated that Soviet forces could achieve the same kind of rapid, decisive victories in Asia that they had achieved in Eastern Europe during the final campaigns against Nazi Germany. The 3-week campaign resulted in the destruction of Japanese military power in mainland China and the occupation of territory larger than Western Europe. More than 80 Japanese military personnel were killed or wounded, while Soviet casualties were remarkably light, considering the scale of the operation. This overwhelming success strengthened Stalin's hand in post-war negotiations and established the Soviet Union as the dominant power in Northeast Asia for decades to come. Colonel General Yamada spent the immediate post-war years in Soviet custody, but his treatment was relatively comfortable compared to many other prisoners of war. Stalin's personal intervention in his case ensured that he was housed in adequate facilities, allowed to maintain correspondence with his family, and given opportunities to assist with the administration of Japanese prisoner repatriation programs. Soviet authorities recognized that Yamada's cooperation was valuable for maintaining order among Japanese prisoners and facilitating the complex logistics of returning hundreds of thousands of people to Japan. His willingness to work with his former enemies, which began with his surrender to Stalin, demonstrated the possibility of constructive relationships between former adversaries when both sides approached negotiations with mutual respect and recognition of legitimate interests. Yamada was finally repatriated to Japan in 1950, 5 years after his surrender to Soviet forces. He returned to a country that had been completely transformed by defeat and occupation, where the military values that had defined his entire adult life had been officially repudiated in favor of pacifist principles enshrined in Japan's new constitution. The Japan to which he returned had abolished its military forces, embraced democratic political institutions, and committed itself to peaceful development under American protection. For a man who had dedicated his life to imperial expansion and military glory, these changes represented a fundamental transformation of everything he had believed in. Yet, Yamada adapted to post-war Japan with the same discipline and sense of duty that had characterized his military service, becoming an advocate for reconciliation between former enemies and supporter of Japan's peaceful development. The personal relationship that developed between Stalin and Yamada during their confrontation in August 1945 represented something unique in the history of World War II, a moment when the highest levels of political leadership engaged directly with individual military commanders to resolve conflicts through negotiation rather than pure force. The fact that both men were able to find common ground despite representing opposing ideologies and nations at war demonstrated the possibility of rational discourse even in the most extreme circumstances. Their exchange became a model for how professional soldiers could maintain personal honor while adapting to changing political realities, and how political leaders could achieve strategic objectives while respecting the legitimate concerns of former enemies. Stalin died in 1953, but his approach to the Yamada situation continued to influence Soviet policy toward Japan throughout the Cold War period. The precedent of treating Japanese military leaders with respect while maintaining firm control over strategic outcomes became a template for Soviet diplomacy in Asia, where the USSR sought to balance competition with the United States against the need for stable relationships with regional powers. Yamada's willingness to cooperate with Soviet authorities, despite his initial resistance, demonstrated that former enemies could find ways to work together when both sides approached negotiations with realistic expectations and mutual recognition of legitimate interests. The broader historical significance of the Stalin-Yamada confrontation extends beyond its immediate military and diplomatic consequences to illuminate the complex relationship between personal honor, political loyalty, and strategic necessity in modern warfare. Both men were products of societies that emphasized collective loyalty over individual preferences, yet both found ways to navigate the demands of honor while adapting to changing circumstances. Their interaction demonstrated that even in total war, there remained space for personal relationships, mutual respect, and negotiated solutions that served the interests of all parties. This lesson would prove valuable in subsequent conflicts where military victory needed to be translated into sustainable political arrangements. Colonel General Yamada died in Tokyo in 1965, 20 years after his surrender to Stalin. His funeral was attended by former colleagues from both the Imperial Japanese Army and veterans organizations that had emerged in post-war Japan. Speakers at the ceremony emphasized his loyalty to duty, his concern for his soldiers' welfare, and his contribution to post-war reconciliation between Japan and the Soviet Union. The inscription on his gravestone reads simply, "A soldier who served with honor," reflecting the complex legacy of a man who had fought for an empire that ultimately disappeared, but who had found ways to serve his country's interests even in defeat. His example influenced a generation of Japanese veterans who faced similar challenges in adapting military values to peaceful civilian society. Stalin's handling of the Yamada situation became part of Soviet military doctrine regarding the treatment of surrendering enemy commanders. Training materials for Soviet officers emphasized the importance of understanding cultural factors in enemy decision-making and the value of personal negotiations in achieving strategic objectives. The Stalin-Yamada exchange was studied in Soviet military academies as an example of how political leadership could achieve better results through direct engagement than through purely military solutions. This approach proved valuable in subsequent Soviet operations in Eastern Europe and Asia, where political and cultural factors often determined the success or failure of military campaigns. The story of the confrontation between Stalin and Yamada reveals fundamental truths about leadership, honor, and the possibility of finding common ground even between enemies. It demonstrates that personal relationships can sometimes achieve what military force alone cannot, and that mutual respect between adversaries can create opportunities for solutions that serve everyone's interests. In an age when conflicts often seem intractable and negotiations impossible, the example of these two men finding ways to work together despite representing opposing sides in a total war offers hope that rational discourse and mutual understanding remain possible even in the most challenging circumstances. If this story moved you the same way it moved us, please do us a favor. Leave your like on this video. Every like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about military leaders who chose negotiation over destruction. Moments when enemies found common ground. And times when individual character changed the course of history. Real people, real courage, real wisdom. Leave a comment now and tell us where you're watching from. United States, Russia, Japan, Germany, Canada. Our community extends around the world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for ensuring that Colonel General Yamada and Premier Stalin's remarkable encounter doesn't disappear into silence. These moments of human connection in the midst of war deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that possible. Educational note. While this story is based on the historical Operation August Storm and the real capture of Colonel General Yamada, some dialogue and specific personal interactions have been dramatized for educational and entertainment purposes to illustrate the broader historical context and human elements of this significant military operation.